The day Mark got his huge raise was the best day of my life. Seriously, the best. We'd been married for 7 years, and for 7 years, I'd been the rock, the reliable one, the one with the steady paycheck. I work as a mechanic, you know, surrounded by the smell of grease and oil all day at the local car factory, putting in those long, physical shifts. It was honest work, and I loved it, but it wasn't glamorous. Mark, bless his heart, worked in the office side of the same factory, doing project management. He's a big-picture guy, but his actual salary had always been fine. Just fine. Enough to cover his half of the mortgage and the bills, but we weren't exactly drowning in savings. So, when he came home that Tuesday, his tie slightly askew, a stupidly wide grin splitting his face, I knew something massive had changed. "Eve," he said, practically shouting, throwing his briefcase onto the sofa with reckless abandon, "you are looking at a 35% bump. 35, and a hefty bonus." I remember dropping the wrench I was cleaning. It clattered against the concrete floor of our garage, a sound that was immediately drowned out by the noise in my head. 35%. That was enough to finally tackle the house renovations we'd been putting off, the kitchen, the dodgy electrics, maybe even a vacation that didn't involve camping 3 hours away. I rushed over and threw my arms around him, smelling the faint but distinct scent of a new, expensive cologne he'd started wearing, a subtle change I hadn't paid attention to before. "Are you serious? Mark, that's incredible. What did you do? Did you finally land the Miller contract?" I asked, pulling back to look into his eyes. That's when he hit me with a phrase that, looking back now, should have set off every alarm bell I owned. "I've been working closely with Sarah Vance, my superior, on the internal restructuring and the new client acquisition. It's been brutal, late nights, early mornings, but the board saw the results. She really went to bat for me. Working closely. At the time, I heard a good, dedicated employee earning his stripes. I saw my brilliant, hard-working husband finally getting the recognition he deserved. I thought of it as a badge of honor. He had been stressed, moody, and barely present for the last 3 months. He'd be glued to his phone, constantly responding to emails, and the phrase, "Sarah needs this by morning," became the new bedtime story. He even started spending a few nights a week sleeping in the guest room, claiming the project stress, and the need to get up at 4 a.m. meant he couldn't afford to wake me up. I was understanding. I was supportive. I was, frankly, a fool. The money started flowing, and with it, a creeping, unsettling distance. We moved from budgeting every trip to the grocery store to spontaneously buying expensive electronics. Mark bought himself a new watch, not a fancy one, but a sleek, modern smartwatch that cost more than my first car. He started taking his shirts to be professionally pressed. He became meticulous about his appearance, which I thought was just part of his new, higher-level role. I remember him coming home one night, exhausted, but with this weird little skip in his step. He sat down and told me about a long meeting with the client, where he and Sarah had to put on a show to secure the deal. We had to pretend everything was locked in, even though we were still waiting on 2 key supplier sign-offs, he chuckled, shaking his head. It was like corporate acting, Eve. We even had a secret code phrase for when the client brought up those specific supplier names. I was so focused on how proud I was of his high-stakes maneuvering that I missed the key word, we. He and Sarah were a team, a highly effective unit, and I attributed their success to professional synergy. The truth was, they were a conspiratorial unit, and the synergy wasn't in the boardroom. I started to notice tiny, almost invisible cracks in the facade. He'd shower the moment he got home, even on nights when he said he'd just been in the office all day. He changed his phone password and started taking his urgent work calls outside, pacing the driveway. I told myself it was the pressure. That big raise came with big responsibility. And let's be honest, who doesn't want to believe the best about the person they've built their life with? But there was one night, just a few weeks after the big announcement, that really sticks in my mind. He was scrolling through his work messages on his laptop, and I walked past, leaning over to give him a goodnight kiss. On the screen, a text bubble popped up. It was from Sarah Vance. The text was blurred, but the accompanying emoji wasn't. It was the winking face with the tongue sticking out. That's not a professional emoji. Not for a superior to a subordinate about a quarterly report. I shook off the doubt. Maybe she was just quirky. Maybe they had a weird work-friend dynamic. I tried to focus on the positives. The savings account was looking healthy. The mortgage was suddenly manageable, and Mark seemed genuinely happier, even if he was never home. If you're watching this video, pause for a second and drop a comment right now telling me where you are in the world and what time it is when you're watching this. I want to see how far the story travels. The phrase, working closely, echoed in my head, now sounding less like a professional description and more like a cruel euphemism. The more I dismissed the tiny, nagging feeling in my gut, the louder it became, until it was a siren screaming in a dark alley. I was basking in the glow of his newfound success, unaware that the foundation of that success wasn't hard work and dedication, but deceit and betrayal. That raise wasn't a reward for Mark's professional acumen. It was hush money for a secret alliance, an alliance that was about to blow up our entire life. I just hadn't found the match yet, but I was getting closer. I was already smelling the sulfur. Our factory life, was all about routine, consistency, and the sheer, brutal honesty of metal and engines. I spent my days in the garage, Eve Rodriguez, hands deep in torque converters and transmission fluid. There's a beautiful simplicity to that job. Either the engine works or it doesn't. You can't lie to a carburetor. Mark, on the other hand, dealt in projections, meetings, and client optics, which, as I would soon discover, was a world built on expertly crafted lies. Our life together was built on the foundation of my tangible, steady work and his seemingly ascending corporate hustle. We had built a very comfortable existence, not lavish but solid. The house was a decent split level in a quiet neighborhood, smelling perpetually of my wrench oil and his overly potent air freshener, a necessity, he joked, after hours of sitting in the stale office air. My salary, while not executive level, was reliable. It paid the bills, it covered the insurance, and it funded the small, 2-week camping trips we used to take before his new project started. Mark's contribution was supposed to be the gravy, the extra money for fun and savings. When his new project started, everything shifted. Suddenly, he wasn't just Mark. He was a key player in the Phoenix Initiative, a massive overhaul of the factory supply chain and a high-stakes play for a new, huge corporate client. He became utterly consumed. His work uniform was no longer just a rotation of slightly rumpled business shirts, but a whole arsenal of new suits, perfectly tailored, smelling of that expensive, new cologne I mentioned earlier. He said it was important for the optics when meeting the high-level client. I saw a man taking his career seriously. Our conversations dwindled down to 2 main topics: how stressed he was and how much Sarah Vance was demanding. Sarah, his superior, was painted as this relentless corporate shark, brilliant, demanding, and utterly impossible to please. Mark would come home, vent for exactly 5 minutes about some impossible deadline she'd set, then retreat to his laptop or the work call driveway pacing. "She's killing me, Eve. This woman doesn't sleep," he'd sigh, rubbing his temples dramatically. "She wants everything yesterday. But she's right, this client is a whale. If we land this, it changes everything for the factory and for me." I bought into the narrative hook, line, and sinker. I cooked him big dinners he barely touched. I stopped asking him to help me fix the dripping faucet. I even started setting my alarm a half-hour early just to make him a protein shake before he rushed out the door for his 5 a.m. start. I was his supportive partner, the strong foundation beneath his high-stress, high-rise corporate drama. I genuinely believed that my sacrificing a little bit of our time now was an investment in our future. He'd occasionally talk about the specifics of the project, focusing heavily on how much needed to be managed and how many corners had to be creatively rounded to meet the client's impossible budget. He talked about massaging the numbers and presenting the ideal future state, even if the current state was a logistical nightmare. It all sounded like typical, albeit slightly dodgy corporate speak. The key thing I missed was the sheer level of collusion he was describing. It wasn't just his professional skills being tested. It was their shared dishonesty. He was constantly justifying the late hours and intense commitment by reminding me of the impending deadline and the sheer weight of the responsibility Sarah had placed on him. "You have no idea, Eve. I'm basically living at the office. We're glued to these reports," he'd say, always using the collective we. Sarah and I are the only two people who truly grasped the complexity of this entire bid. The way he spoke about her was always professionally respectful, almost reverent, which ironically made me less suspicious. I thought, well, of course, he respects his tough, successful female superior. He never mentioned her looks, or anything inappropriate, which lulled me into a false sense of security. The red flags were all there, but they were dressed up in bespoke suits and explained away with spreadsheets and PowerPoint decks. The physical distance was the hardest part, the thing that frayed my nerves most, even more than the stress. He stopped initiating physical contact. Hugs became fleeting. Kisses were pecked on the cheek as he sprinted past, and our shared evenings on the sofa watching terrible reality TV were replaced by the glow of his laptop. When I tried to talk about it, he'd pivot immediately back to work stress. Honey, I'm just drained. Mentally fried. I can't relax until this deal is signed. Sarah's pushing me so hard, I'm literally seeing numbers in my sleep. I would apologize for pressuring him, for not being more understanding. I thought I was being selfish. After all, he was sacrificing his time and mental health for our future. The irony stings even now. He was making sacrifices, yes, but not the kind I thought. He was sacrificing his integrity, his honesty, and his commitment to me, all while I was cheering him on from the sidelines, grease on my hands, a proud, trusting smile on my face. It was this context of intense pressure, the high stakes of the Phoenix Initiative, and the constant invocation of Sarah Vance's demanding nature that paved the way for the ultimate lie. He built the narrative so perfectly that when the raise came, I didn't question how he got it. I just assumed he earned it through sheer willpower and the grueling, all-consuming close working relationship with his superior. I was so proud of the destination, I failed to check the route. The problem with a simple, honest life like mine is that you project that honesty onto others. I didn't know how to factor in corporate deceit and secret affairs. Those were the plot points of TV dramas, not my sturdy mechanic and project manager marriage. But the script was already being written, and Mark was just about to cast the leading lady in a role I never auditioned for. The introduction was over. The conflict was about to begin. The Phoenix Initiative wasn't just a project, it was the name of the new goddess Mark worshipped, Sarah Vance. I know I mentioned her earlier, but it's time to really introduce the woman who wasn't just Mark's boss, but his downfall. Sarah Vance arrived at the factory about 6 months before the big raise, a hurricane in tailored pencil skirts. She was young, maybe mid-30s, sharp, and had this terrifyingly confident way of speaking that made everyone in the office shuffle their papers nervously. Mark, who had always been a bit intimidated by highly driven women, was immediately drawn into her orbit, professionally at first. Mark described her as ruthless, brilliant, and someone who cuts through the BS like a laser. I even felt a grudging admiration. Our factory was old school, it needed a shake-up, and Mark, my sweet, occasionally timid husband, was finally catching the eye of a powerful executive. But as the pressure mounted, the boundary between professional admiration and something else started to blur, almost imperceptibly. Remember how he was suddenly showering the minute he got home, even if he claimed he'd been at his desk all day? He explained it away. Sarah insists on an absolutely spotless, sterile office environment Eve. She's obsessed with presentation, so I feel like I'm contaminated by the time I get home. Again, a plausible, if slightly odd, corporate detail. Then there was the wardrobe change. Mark suddenly needed 3 new pairs of expensive, slim-fit trousers. He was a creature of habit. Khakis and a polo shirt were his weekend uniform. Now, it was designer denim and perfectly fitted jackets. He claimed he was networking more on the weekends, going to informal client dinners Sarah arranged. The smell of his new cologne, previously faint, was now pervasive. It was a musky, expensive scent, the kind that lingers. I tried to bridge the growing gap between us. I attempted to engage in his work drama, asking about the progress of the Miller client deal. He'd give me vague, sweeping answers, always circling back to Sarah. Sarah handled the whole presentation. She's a genius at spinning the financials. I just made sure the technical specs were ready, he'd say, sounding exhausted but energized at the same time. The energy felt like residual adrenaline, the kind you get after pulling off something risky. I started to notice tiny, nonverbal cues that, when compiled, painted a much darker picture than I was willing to see. One morning, I found a hair tie, a silky lavender scrunchie, tucked down the side of his car seat. Mine are all black, thick elastics, designed to withstand a mechanic's shift. When I asked him about it, casually, while sorting laundry, he didn't even skip a beat. "Oh, Sarah borrowed my car last week for a site visit. Said her rental broke down." "Probably hers," he said, shrugging, his eyes fixed on the TV. The response was too quick, too smooth, too easy. It didn't have the slight pause of genuine recollection. It had the speed of a well-rehearsed lie. I let it go. One hair tie doesn't destroy a marriage, right? But the final, crushing piece of the puzzle that Sarah Vance unintentionally provided was her own public display of admiration. We went to the factory's annual Founders' Day Gala, a notoriously boring, obligatory event. I wore a dress I felt great in, something that didn't smell faintly of engine degreaser. Mark, of course, was in his best new suit, nervously scanning the room. When Sarah Vance approached our table, my immediate, protective instinct was to feel a little inadequate. She looked flawless, a silk dress, perfect makeup, and a demeanor that screamed six-figure salary. She gave me a polite, quick smile, but her focus was entirely on Mark. "Mark, my rock star," she said, her hand briefly, intimately, resting on his elbow. "Honestly, Eve, I don't know how I would have landed the Miller account without him. He's been invaluable, truly working round the clock. It's almost like we're sharing a brain." She laughed, a bright, slightly brittle sound, and then she delivered the line that made my stomach drop into my designer clutch. "I keep telling him he deserves the whole world. That raise was just the down payment." She said this with such a knowing look, a deep, conspiratorial gaze fixed solely on Mark, that it went beyond professional appreciation. It was a secret communicated in public, a layer of understanding that excluded me completely. The whole world sounded a lot like her, and the down payment suddenly felt like a transaction for services rendered, services that went far beyond filling out spreadsheets. Mark was sweating. I could feel the tension radiating off him. He just mumbled a thank you and tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. But the damage was done. I saw the look in their eyes. It wasn't the look of colleagues. It was the look of partners in crime who had just been a little too careless with their secret code. That night, lying next to him in bed, him staring blankly at the ceiling, me pretending to be asleep, I didn't think about the logistics of the Miller contract or the spreadsheets he'd massaged. I thought about the lavender hair tie, the quick denial, the expensive cologne, and the proprietary way Sarah Vance had touched his elbow. The story Mark had sold me, of a stressed, dedicated man working hard for a demanding boss, crumbled under the weight of those tiny, damning details. The working relationship wasn't just close, it was intimate. And it was all happening on my watch, paid for by the raise I was so proud of. The setup was complete, and now I was living inside the lie. I just needed to find the actual evidence. The emotional distance was the final straw, the one thing Mark couldn't blame on Sarah Vance or the stress of the Miller client. Sure, he could use the pressure of the deadline to explain the late nights and the constant phone calls, but he couldn't use it to explain the empty space next to me in bed, or the way he flinched if I casually reached for his hand. The truth is, the more successful he became at work, the more disconnected he became at home. It was like his new, high-earning corporate persona was incompatible with the simple, grounded life we had built. He became a master of deflection, a corporate spin doctor in his own living room. Any question about his time, his mood, or his phone was immediately met with a panicked pivot to his professional martyrdom. "Why are you showering so late, Mark? You just got home." "Eve, seriously? It's Miller. The client is flying in tomorrow." I was packing up files until 10 p.m. and had a huge coffee spill on my suit jacket. Sarah's all over me about presentation. "Can we please not do this? I'm exhausted." He always managed to make me feel like the bad guy for asking a reasonable question. He wrapped his lies in a blanket of overwhelming work stress, and because I genuinely believed he was doing everything for us, I would always back down, apologizing for adding to his burdens. The Phoenix Initiative wasn't just stressful for him, it was a ghost in our house. It dictated our dinner times, our movie nights, and our intimacy schedule, which was, by the way, non-existent. I remember one specific Sunday, the kind of lazy afternoon we used to cherish. The air was cool, and I just finished detailing my classic Mustang project in the garage, feeling good and accomplished. Mark was supposed to be working on a presentation, but he was sprawled out on the sofa, scrolling on his phone, which was strangely silent for once. I walked over, sat down next to him, and rested my head on his shoulder. It was a simple, easy gesture I hadn't made in months. He immediately tensed up. "What's wrong?" I whispered, looking up at him. He sighed, a loud, dramatic exhale. "I can't, Eve. I have to memorize these talking points for Monday. Sarah is reviewing me first thing, and honestly, the sheer volume of this data is making my head spin." He didn't even look at me. He just held his phone in front of his face like a shield. I took the phone out of his hands. Gently but firmly. "Stop. Look at me, Mark. We've had maybe 30 minutes of actual, present conversation in the last 3 weeks. I'm not asking for a detailed audit of your work. I'm asking for my husband. The presentation can wait 5 minutes. Talk to me." He snatched the phone back, his face tight with anger, the kind of anger that comes from being caught, not just interrupted. "You don't get it, do you? You clock out when the last car rolls off the line. My job doesn't end. This is high-level corporate pressure. If I fail this, we lose the raise, we lose the bonus, we lose everything. You need to trust me to manage my time, Eve. This is the price of success." The argument that followed was explosive. Not about another woman, not yet, but about trust and priorities. He weaponized his success against me. He used the raise, the money I was so proud of, as a battering ram to push me away. He made me feel small, like my mechanic's job couldn't possibly compare to the high-level, intellectual demands of his role. He was basically saying, "I am too busy and too important for you now." This pattern of justification became the new normal. Every late return, every skipped dinner, every defensive outburst was justified by the terrifying demands of Sarah Vance and the huge, looming shadow of the Miller contract. And this is where the deeper lie came in. Mark wasn't just lying to me about his commitment. He and Sarah were fundamentally lying to the client. He let slip a critical piece of information that solidified my understanding that their partnership was built on mutual deceit. "We have to be so careful with Miller," he said one night, after too much whiskey. "We told them the new supply chain was fully operational and tested, but we are running on fumes. We basically fabricated the initial performance metrics. If they audit us before the 3-month mark, we are both toast." The way he said toast, not just in trouble, but utterly, completely ruined, suggested a deep, binding secrecy. It wasn't just corporate exaggeration. It was outright fraud being perpetrated against the factory's biggest potential client. And his partner in this high-stakes deception was Sarah Vance. It suddenly clicked into place. The late nights, the close working relationship, the shared secrets, the intimacy of the fraud. It all created an emotional bond far stronger and more intoxicating than the one he had with me. The affair wasn't just a fling. It was the inevitable product of two people who had risked everything together, built a successful, elaborate lie together, and were now reaping the rewards, professional and personal, together. His distance wasn't just stress. It was guilt wrapped in arrogance. He wasn't just working closely with Sarah. They were actively lying, cheating, and building their careers on a foundation of professional deception, with an affair as their secret handshake. And I was standing on the collapsing ground, still believing the money would save us. The suspicion, once a tiny, irritating whisper, grew into a relentless, high-pitched scream I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the big things that got to me anymore. It was the micro-betrayals, the little details that only an intimate partner would notice. I was watching him like a mechanic inspecting a failing engine, looking for the specific, damning point of failure. The event that truly solidified my gut feeling happened not at home, but when I unexpectedly had to go to the office. It was a mundane reason. I was picking up his forgotten lunchbox. He'd been complaining about skipping meals, so I figured I'd be the good wife and bring him a proper sandwich and an apple. I went straight to his office floor, swiping the guest badge I'd used 100 times. The office was quiet, the kind of hushed midday silence that meant everyone was either in meetings or glued to their screens. I found Mark's cubicle, which was, predictably, empty. I left the lunchbox on his desk and was about to leave when I heard voices from the communal kitchenette just around the corner. It was Mark. And Sarah. I couldn't help but pause. My feet were suddenly glued to the carpet. Seriously, Mark, I heard Sarah say, her voice low and playful. Did you really tell Miller that the shipment schedule was optimally phased? Mark let out a genuine, easy laugh, a laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in months. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated relaxation and complicity. Had to. You know they freak out if they think we're not totally on top of it. They bought a hook, line, and sinker. Then Sarah's voice dropped even lower, becoming conspiratorial. You are such a natural liar, honey. It's almost attractive. Honey, that single word, that casual, intimate term of endearment, coupled with a shared glee overlying to a multi-million-dollar client, hit me with the force of a punch. They weren't just discussing work, they were celebrating their shared dishonesty, their mutual moral flexibility. They were in on something together, something exciting and illicit, something that bonded them beyond salary bands and key performance indicators. Then Mark replied, Well, I learned from the best, didn't I? He paused, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a quick, dry kiss. Besides, we have to keep the client happy. That's the only way to justify the stress premium they put on my paycheck. Stress premium. Mark had called his raise a stress premium when he described it to Sarah. When he told me, it was recognition for working closely. The casual use of honey and the clear link between their shared professional deceit and his financial reward snapped everything into focus. The raise wasn't an award for dedication. It was a payoff for his participation in a high-stakes, fraudulent scheme, which just happened to include a personal affair with his co-conspirator. I retreated instantly, stepping backward like a crab, not wanting to be seen. I made it to the elevator and practically bolted out of the building. The sandwich I brought him felt like a literal offering to a god who had just betrayed me. I felt sick. The first doubt, the tiny seed I mentioned in Section 1, had just bloomed into a massive, poisonous tree. The winking emoji, the lavender hair tie, the constant showering, Sarah's proprietorial hand on his elbow at the gala. It wasn't a series of unrelated anomalies. It was a pattern. The pattern of a life I no longer recognized. What stung the most wasn't the cheating itself, though that hurt, it was the shared lie. They were celebrating deceiving people, and I was one of the people they were lying to. They had a bond of professional and personal betrayal that was deeper than anything Mark and I had developed in 7 years of marriage. We'd shared a mortgage. They shared a crime. I drove home in a daze, the sound of Mark's easy laughter and Sarah's whispered, honey echoing in the car. I didn't confront him that night. I was too cold, too precise, too angry to allow him the messy, emotional satisfaction of a tearful confession. I needed proof. Hard proof. The kind of proof that could destroy 2 careers, not just 1 marriage. I didn't want him to just apologize. I wanted him to suffer the consequences of his actions, the financial and professional consequences that were directly tied to his rise. He got a raise for his affair and his lies. Fine. I decided right then and there that the raise would be the very thing that brought him down. The stakes had officially been raised. I was no longer the supportive wife. I was the investigator, and the hunt had begun. The mechanic in me knew that a tiny crack in the chassis meant the whole car was compromised, and Mark's life was about to be put up on the lift for a full, devastating inspection. The realization that the raise was the product of betrayal, professional and personal, intensified the pain but sharpened my focus. The $35% dollar increase wasn't a reward for Mark's brilliance. It was the paycheck paradox. It was the most money he'd ever earned, and it felt like dirty money, a constant, sickening reminder of what he was doing behind my back. I started keeping a separate mental ledger. Every new shirt, every expensive meal out he claimed was client-related, every extra digit on his bank statement was tallied against the emotional debt he was accruing. The money should have made our lives easier, but it felt like lead weights tied to my ankles. We could now afford a down payment on a luxury SUV, but we couldn't afford 5 minutes of honest conversation. The way Mark carried himself changed, too. He didn't just look successful, he looked arrogant. He started talking down to me subtly, criticizing my work schedule. Must be nice to clock out exactly at 5, Eve, or questioning my knowledge of finance. You wouldn't understand the risk management, it's high-level stuff. The raise had given him not just cash, but an inflated sense of superiority, making the betrayal feel even more insulting. He felt untouchable, shielded by his success. My focus turned entirely to his work laptop. He kept it in his briefcase, claiming it was company property and too sensitive to leave lying around. The mechanic in me knew that the highest value information is always locked down. I needed the messages, the emails, the paper trail that linked the raise, the affair, and the client fraud altogether. Mark had changed his passwords after the promotion, another small, suspicious detail he waved off as a new company-wide security policy. I couldn't just guess a complex corporate password. I had to wait for the perfect opportunity. It arrived during a rare, high-stakes moment of shared life, a sudden, severe flu. Mark was absolutely flattened, running a high fever, curled up miserably in the guest room where he'd taken up semi-permanent residence anyway. He was too weak to even argue when I insisted on bringing him soup and checking his temperature. When he finally drifted into a deep, feverish sleep one Saturday morning, I knew my window was open. I moved like a ghost. I found his briefcase under the bed, the leather cold and smooth. My hands were steady, despite the adrenaline surge. I pulled out the laptop. The password screen was glowing. I tried my birthday, our anniversary, our old dog's name, nothing. Then I remembered a key piece of information he had casually thrown at me months ago, trying to sound smart. My new login is based on the client acquisition number, Eve. Hard to forget, but impossible to guess. The Miller client was the key to everything. I knew the factory's corporate naming convention. I typed in a combination based on the internal project code, the Miller name, and the current year. On the third try, the laptop clicked open. The screen flared and I was in. My heart was pounding, so hard I felt it in my fingertips. I didn't waste time on desktop files. I went straight for his work communication apps, specifically the one he and Sarah used for secure internal communication. I bypassed the boring email chains and found the chat history for Sarah Vance. And there it was, a relentless, sickening stream of messages, hundreds of them, stretching back 3 months. The early messages were professional, discussing project deliverables and deadlines. Then, a sharp, undeniable pivot. They started discussing the numbers massage, the fabricated data they presented to Miller. They were laughing about it, using emojis to signify their shared dishonesty. Sarah, Miller bid on the delivery schedule. We're magicians, Mark. Top hat sparkles. Mark, more like master criminals. Gotta celebrate this. You coming over to the apartment later? Sarah, wouldn't miss it. We should definitely talk through the stress premium justification again. Winking face. The term stress premium was everywhere, always followed by flirtatious, explicit exchanges. The apartment wasn't a corporate rental, it was a discreet, temporary flat they were using. He wasn't just working closely, he was sleeping with her, actively committing fraud with her, and then using the financial success of their twin deceptions to justify his new salary and his absence from home. The evidence was overwhelming and brutal. It wasn't just physical cheating, it was a total conspiracy. They had colluded to defraud the client and their own company, and the affair was simply a byproduct of their shared criminal activity. The raise was, literally, a part of the criminal payoff. I didn't weep. I didn't scream. I felt an intense, cold clarity. The moral dilemma was gone. This wasn't just about a broken marriage. It was about professional misconduct, fraud, and a fundamental breach of trust that transcended our relationship. Mark and Sarah had built their castle on sand and lies, and I was now holding the detonation trigger. The decision was not of to expose them, but how to ensure maximum, irreparable damage to their careers and the financial life he thought he'd secured for himself with his dirty money. The moral quagmire had become a clear path of vengeance, and I was going to take it. The moment I closed Mark's laptop, the cold, hard drive humming silently in the quiet room, the moral dilemma vanished. There was no if anymore. This wasn't just a husband cheating. This was a partner in my life actively collaborating in a corporate fraud scheme, using his superior as both a professional and personal accomplice. The affair was repulsive, but the lies to the client were the actionable, professional sin that had bought him the raise and the sense of invincibility. I felt a clarity that was almost unnerving. I didn't want a messy confrontation. I didn't want him to cry, beg, or try to gaslight me with more talk of work stress. I wanted justice delivered with the precision of a perfectly timed mechanical failure. My first act was to secure the evidence. I wasn't an idiot. I knew simply printing out the messages could be messy. I used the laptop's built-in screenshot function and carefully captured the entire damning conversation thread between Mark and Sarah Vance. I didn't just focus on the explicit, personal messages, honey. Apartment later, I prioritized the professional treason. The discussion about fabricating the supply chain metrics, the agreement to massage the numbers for the Miller client, and the explicit references to their shared stress premium, the illegal payoff. I saved the files onto a secure, encrypted flash drive that I kept separate from everything else. The next step was to figure out the best targets. Mark and Sarah had hurt me, but they had also committed major professional misconduct against their employer and, critically, defrauded the new client, Miller Corporation. Hitting only the factory's HR might just get Mark quietly fired and Sarah reprimanded. I wanted maximum exposure and career devastation. I needed 2 recipients. The first was obvious: human resources, HR at the factory. I needed to focus on the sexual misconduct and the breach of the company's integrity and compliance policies. I used an anonymous burner email account I'd set up years ago for online classifieds, a digital fingerprint that could not be traced back to Eve Rodriguez. The email was concise, professional, and devastatingly factual. Subject: urgent compliance and ethics violation, Project Phoenix Initiative. To whom it may concern, I have evidence of severe compliance and ethical violations involving Mark Johnson, project manager, and Sarah Vance, director of project management, regarding the Phoenix Initiative and the Miller Corporation contract. The violations include sexual misconduct / affair, superior / subordinate relationship, leveraging position, corporate fraud, collusion to falsify supply chain performance metrics and financial data presented to Miller Corporation, see attached evidence. Misappropriation of funds / kickbacks. The recent pay increase granted to Mark Johnson was directly correlated to his participation in this fraudulent scheme. The full, dated communication log is attached. I advise immediate internal audit and contact with Miller Corporation before they discover the fraud themselves. The second recipient was the key to true destruction, a specific, high-level executive contact at Miller Corporation. I found his name and direct corporate email through some dedicated searching in Mark's work address book. This was the individual who was personally signing off on the multi-million-dollar deal. This email had to focus purely on the fraud. Subject: urgent, critical, fabricated data and Phoenix Initiative proposal. Dear Mr. Miller, executive name. I am writing anonymously as an internal whistleblower. Mark Johnson and Sarah Vance have colluded to falsify critical data presented to your team regarding the operational status and performance metrics of the new supply chain in the Phoenix Initiative. Your current contract terms are based on fraudulent information, and the project is running months behind the metrics presented. I have attached the internal communication proof of this collusion and deceit. An immediate, independent audit is required before closing the deal. This is a massive professional risk to Miller Corp. I attached the same evidence to both emails, ensuring the file names were neutral and professional. internal_communication_audit_evidence.pdf. I didn't hit send immediately. I sat there for a full 20 minutes, rereading every word, checking every attachment. This was it. This action was irreversible. It wasn't just ending my marriage. It was blowing up 2 careers, potentially causing a major corporate scandal, and risking a significant client loss for the factory itself. But I reasoned that the fraud would eventually be discovered anyway. I was just accelerating the timetable and ensuring the people responsible paid the price. Finally, with a single, calm press of the return key, I launched the emails. The relief wasn't immediate, but the feeling of having taken decisive action was empowering. I deleted the burner account and the files on the flash drive, then wiped the history on Mark's laptop, leaving it exactly as I found it. No trace, no lingering suspicion. I put the laptop back in the briefcase and tucked the briefcase back under his bed. I then walked to the kitchen and made myself a strong cup of tea, watching the steam curl upwards. Mark was still asleep, feverish, and unaware that the tower of lies he had built was already beginning to crumble, the destruction set in motion by the quiet action of the wife he thought was too simple to notice his elaborate corporate games. The bomb had been planted. Now, all I had to do was wait for the explosion. The moments after hitting send were the weirdest of my entire life. I had just launched 2 nuclear missiles at my husband's career, and yet, life kept moving. Mark woke up from his feverish sleep an hour later, demanding a ginger ale, completely oblivious to the fact that I had just signed his corporate death warrant. This period of silence, the time between the email launch and the inevitable factory explosion, was agonizing. It was a pressure cooker where Mark and Sarah continued their charade, not knowing the ticking clock I'd set. They were walking around, smug and self-assured, while I knew they were mere days away from professional ruin. Mark, now feeling slightly better, came downstairs and tried to act like a husband again, probably out of a residual sense of guilt from being sick and having me nurse him. He brought up his new raise, talking about how we should use some of the bonus money to replace my old, failing toolbox. "You deserve something new, Eve," he said, leaning against the kitchen counter, his voice still a little raspy. "We're finally in the big leagues now. No more cheap equipment." The sheer arrogance of that comment, offering me a replacement for the tools I used to earn honest money, paid for by the money he earned from fraud and cheating, made me want to scream. But I held it in. I just gave him a tight, non-committal smile. "Maybe," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the kettle. "I like my old tools. They're reliable." The irony was thick enough to choke on. He was talking about upgrading my life with his dirty money, and I was counting the minutes until he lost the source of that money entirely. I had to maintain the illusion of the supportive, oblivious wife. I listened to him talk about Sarah, but now I heard every mention of her name as a fresh stab. He started getting a little frantic a few days later. Not about the emails, but about the client. The real pressure of the impending Miller deadline was closing in. He and Sarah were still desperately trying to cover their tracks, rushing to get the actual supply chain metrics closer to the fabricated ones. "Sarah is a wreck," he muttered one evening, nervously fiddling with his phone. "They've sent an auditor to the factory floor, completely unannounced. We need to be on top of this. If they find the discrepancy now, before the final signing, it's going to look terrible." The auditor? I hadn't thought about that. My email to Miller Corporation must have landed, and they had reacted instantly, sending a highly suspicious third party to confirm the data. The seeds of my anonymous strike were beginning to sprout, causing chaos exactly where I intended them to. Mark and Sarah were now communicating in urgent, whispered phone calls and veiled text messages, trying to coordinate their stories and cover the factual holes in their presentation. I watched him stress, not with empathy, but with a clinical satisfaction. He was panicking over the professional consequences, not the moral ones. I realized I needed to disappear a little bit. If the fallout hit while I was standing right next to him, my sudden departure would look suspicious. I took an extra-long shift at the factory garage, claiming they were short-handed. I even called my sister, who lived a few hours away, and told her I might need to crash on her couch for a night or two because I was feeling stressed and needed a break. I was laying the groundwork for my exit, ensuring I was physically and emotionally distant when the explosion finally came. The stress broke him down further. He started snapping at me, drinking too much wine in the evenings, and spending entire nights locked in his home office, supposedly reviewing files, but really just trying to panic fix a fraudulent contract. "You just don't understand the kind of pressure I'm under, Eve," he yelled at me one night, his eyes bloodshot, fueled by cheap corporate desperation. I finally allowed myself a small sliver of the truth, carefully phrased to not betray my knowledge. "I understand what fraud is, Mark, and lying to a massive client to get a raise seems like a dangerous game." He froze. His face went pale. "What are you talking about? Who said anything about fraud?" I kept my face perfectly neutral. "The way you and Sarah talk about the numbers massage and the stress premium, it just sounds like you're doing something unethical. That's all." He took a shaky breath, clearly deciding how much to confess. "It's corporate maneuvering, Eve. Everyone does it. It's how you get ahead. Don't worry your head about it. It's under control. Under control." He said that just hours before the silence broke. The next morning, as I was getting ready for work, the phone rang. It was an unusual, professional-sounding number. Mark answered it, and his voice went from annoyed to rigidly controlled. I heard him say, "Yes, Mr. Vance. My office. Now. I see." He hung up, his hand visibly shaking. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. "I have to go to the main office immediately," he stammered, grabbing his suit jacket. "Sarah's father, he's the general counsel, he's there. And the HR director. They said it's urgent." I just stared at him, my expression unreadable. I knew what this was. The waiting was over. The anonymous strike had landed. The consequences of his affair, his raise, and his lies were finally knocking on the door, dressed in a lawyer's suit. He thought he was going to a meeting. He was going to his firing. Mark left the house that morning with a nervous energy that was nearly palpable. He was utterly convinced this urgent meeting was about the Miller audit, a sudden emergency where he and Sarah needed to perform corporate damage control together. He even paused at the door, adjusting his tie, and said, "Wish me luck, Eve. Sarah and I need to be a united front here." I just nodded, a stone face masking the sheer, terrible satisfaction bubbling up inside me. A united front. Little did he know, their entire structure of deceit was about to collapse, and I was the demolition expert. The next few hours were torture, but a beautiful, necessary torture. I went to the factory garage for my shift, trying to focus on engines, but my mind was stuck in the quiet, carpeted corporate offices upstairs. Every time my phone vibrated with a text about a faulty fuel line, my heart leaped, expecting the explosion. I kept a close eye on the office entrance from the garage bay doors during my lunch break. About 2 hours after Mark left, I saw a flurry of unusual activity. First, a car I recognized, a sleek, black sedan with tinted windows, the kind used by high-level security or legal teams, pulled up to the executive entrance. Then, a few minutes later, I saw Sarah Vance. She wasn't her usual hurricane self. She was walking with rigid, unnatural posture, flanked by 2 people in sober suits who looked like HR security. She had her handbag clutched tightly, her perfect makeup somehow looking smeared even from a distance. She was being escorted out of the building with a speed and finality that screamed terminal. She didn't look up, didn't look left or right, just straight ahead. She was gone within a minute. That confirmed the first strike had landed. Sarah Vance was done. The factory had moved quickly and decisively, which meant the evidence of the affair and the corporate fraud must have been undeniable. I went back to my workstation, a strange lightness filling my chest. Sarah was out. But what about Mark? The silence stretched for another agonizing hour. Then, I got a text, not from Mark, but from my friend and coworker, Carlos, who works on the assembly line but has a brother who works maintenance in the corporate offices. "Carlos, dude, whole office is a madhouse. Mark's door is shut. I saw a security guy waiting outside his office like a vulture." My blood ran cold, then hot. It was happening. I felt a fierce surge of anxiety, not for Mark, but for the clarity of the outcome. I didn't want him to weasel out of this. I needed the final, complete destruction of the lie he'd built. Finally, just before 3 p.m., I saw the security sedan pull up again. This time, the door opened, and out stepped Mark. He didn't look like the man who had left the house that morning, talking about united fronts. He looked utterly dismantled. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose and pulled to one side, and his face was a mottled shade of red and white. He wasn't walking. He was being propelled forward by an internal momentum that suggested a controlled, but forced exit. The security guard, a burly, emotionless man I'd seen a few times, walked right next to him. Mark had a small cardboard box clutched to his chest, the universal symbol of the corporate walk of shame. It contained his personal effects, a coffee mug, a framed picture of us from years ago, the sight of which gave me a sick, hollow feeling, and a stress ball. As he reached his car, he stopped and looked back at the towering corporate building. There was a look of disbelief on his face, the realization that his entire identity, the successful project manager, the high earner, the corporate player, had been stripped away in a single meeting. He got into his car and sped out of the parking lot, tires squealing slightly. He didn't even glance toward the garage where he knew I worked. He was too focused on his ruin. I got back to my apartment before he did, claiming I felt sick and leaving the factory early. I was sitting on the sofa, waiting, when I heard his car pull into the driveway. He stumbled into the house, dropping the box with a heavy thud. The energy that had defined him for the last 6 months The arrogance, the stress, the false confidence was completely gone, replaced by a devastating emptiness. "They fired me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They FING fired me, Eve." He finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading confusion. "They said they had incontrovertible proof of misconduct. Professional misconduct. They said they were pressing charges for fraud and breach of contract, and that Miller Corporation is pulling the entire deal. They escorted Sarah out, too." What the hell happened? He never mentioned the affair, not in that moment. The betrayal of the client and the loss of his career were the only things that registered. The raise that gave him everything had, in one devastating afternoon, taken it all away. He was exposed, ruined, and still, somehow, completely blind to the true source of his downfall. The fire I started had consumed everything, and his shock was the final, satisfying sound. He had lost the job, the raise, and the respect of the industry he tried so hard to conquer. The only thing left to settle was the house. The immediate aftermath was a strange blend of furious panic from Mark and cool, deliberate strategy from me. He paced the living room, shouting into his now useless work phone, trying to reach Sarah, HR, anyone who could tell him how to undo the damage. I watched him, completely detached. He was like a broken automaton, repeatedly running the same, failed corporate damage control sequence. "They can't do this, Eve. I got a massive raise. That proves I was valued. I was instrumental to the Phoenix initiative. This is a massive mistake, a misunderstanding," he ranted, completely missing the point that the raise was the evidence of the fraud. He finally turned to me, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. "You have to tell them, Eve. Tell them how hard I was working. Tell them Sarah was putting impossible pressure on me. Tell them it was necessary corporate maneuvering. Necessary corporate maneuvering to defraud a multi-million-dollar client." I asked, my voice flat, holding the cardboard box of his pathetic office possessions. "That's what you want me to tell them?" The mention of the fraud made him flinch, finally realizing that the professional lie was the core problem, not just the affair. "Eve, we need to think about the house. The mortgage. The bills. They cut off my factory access, and they said they're freezing my accounts pending a legal review," he said, the sheer terror of financial ruin finally overriding his arrogance. "The raise, the bonus, it was all tied up in that. If we don't have that income, we lose everything." This was the opening I had been waiting for, the moment I could deliver the twist that had been simmering for months. "No, Mark," I said, meeting his panicked gaze with a cold, steady one. "We don't lose everything. You lose everything." He stared at me, dumbfounded. "What are you talking about? We're married. Everything is shared." I set the box down and walked to the small filing cabinet in the corner of the room, pulling out a manila envelope I had prepared a year ago. It was a file I called my contingency plan. Remember about a year and a half ago when my uncle, the lawyer, helped me set up my own independent mechanic business on the side? I asked, pulling out a stack of documents. Mark scoffed. "Yeah, your little hobby. Working on classic cars for cash. What does that have to do with this disaster?" "It had everything to do with protecting my assets," I corrected him. "See this account? The Eve Rodriguez separate business account. I've been running all my personal mechanic work through it, paying taxes and everything. It's entirely separate from our joint finances. So, that's maybe a few $1,000s, he dismissed, still focused on his lost executive salary. "It's more than a few thousand, Mark. Remember when we refinanced the house 3 years ago? And I was the one with the steady, reliable income history, while yours was fluctuating." I slid a key document across the table. It was the deed to the house. "When we refinanced, Uncle Jim, my lawyer, made sure to adjust the ownership structure," I explained, tapping the paper. "Because the down payment came from my earlier savings, and because I was the only one with a reliably fixed income, the deed was restructured. The title of the house is held as tenancy in common with a specific clause. In the event of financial insolvency or professional misconduct leading to account seizure by a primary income holder, the non-offending party retains the right to buy out the equity at a fixed, predetermined rate." I paused, letting the legal jargon sink in. He looked completely bewildered. "Mark," my steady, honest paycheck paid the baseline mortgage for 7 years. Your flashy, massive raise just paid for extras. When I saw how reckless and secretive you became after the Phoenix initiative started, I went back to Uncle Jim 6 months ago. We updated that clause. I opened the envelope and pulled out the final document. This is the notice I filed 2 weeks ago, right after I sent the emails. It legally initiates the buyout of your equity. My lawyer will finalize the transfer tomorrow morning. The heir left the room. Mark staggered backward, hitting the wall. You planned this? You waited? You knew. I knew your behavior was going to ruin us financially, I said, my voice rising for the first time. And I wasn't going to let your affair and your fraud cost me the home I spent 7 years working for. Your equity is now secured in a separate account, ready to be transferred to your name alone. But the house is mine. He got the raise, the expensive clothes, the secret apartment, and the thrilling partnership with Sarah Vance. But I got the only thing that mattered, stability. I got the deed, the keys, and the undeniable satisfaction of knowing that my quiet, honest labor and foresight had ultimately protected my future from his catastrophic, dishonest gamble. The raise that was meant to buy his freedom, and my silence instead bought him a cardboard box and an eviction notice. The silence that followed my declaration about the house was the most satisfying thing I'd ever experienced. Mark, the man who had always had an answer for everything, whose entire career was built on talking his way out of trouble, was utterly speechless. He could handle being called a cheater or a fraud, but he couldn't handle the complete, irreversible financial loss I'd orchestrated. You set me up, he finally croaked, the color draining from his face. You went to a lawyer, you planned this. All this time, you were just waiting for me to fail. You set yourself up, Mark. I countered, my voice steady. I wasn't angry anymore. I was a judge delivering a carefully considered verdict. I was waiting for you to respect our marriage and our shared life. When you replaced that with secrets, lies, and a close working relationship that was literally a criminal enterprise, I just protected the stable future I built with my own hands. He grabbed the house deed, crumpling the edges in his shaking hands. This is insane. The raise, the bonus, that's all matrimonial assets. I'll fight this. I'll tell them you knew about the fraud, that you're complicit. You'll tell who, Mark? I asked, raising an eyebrow. HR? The people who have the messages showing you and Sarah discussing the stress premium payoff for fabricating client data? The people who now know you were having an affair with your superior and committing corporate fraud? The people who will see that my mechanic's income was the only stable thing holding up our mortgage, and your dirty money was used for frivolous things like that new watch and those tailored suits. I walked over to the kitchen island and picked up the lavender scrunchie I had deliberately kept and placed on the counter. You think a judge is going to side with the man who leveraged an affair and fraud into a temporary raise against the wife who quietly secured the primary asset of the marriage years ago? You underestimated me. You thought because I fix cars for a living, I couldn't understand your high-level corporate games. But I understand systems, Mark. I know how to find the weak point, and I know how to replace a faulty part. The realization washed over him like a cold wave. He was financially and legally powerless. The fraud made his sudden, massive income suspect, and my prior legal maneuvers and stable income made me the reliable asset holder. His raise, the thing he had been so proud of, the thing he believed made him superior, was precisely the thing that made his assets vulnerable. He slumped onto the sofa, his head in his hands. Sarah lost her job too, didn't she? Yes, I confirmed, and her father is the general counsel. I imagine her professional downfall is going to be far more spectacular and messy than yours. The next few weeks were a blur of legal maneuvers. I stayed with my sister for a few days, giving Mark time to fully absorb the reality and to pack his things. He didn't put up a fight. His lawyer, a frantic, low-level guy he'd found online, took one look at Uncle Jim's detailed, ironclad paperwork, the evidence of corporate fraud, and the sealed divorce papers I had already prepared, and advised Mark to accept the terms immediately. The divorce was quick and quiet. Mark signed everything, defeated. His equity in the house was transferred to a separate account in his name, per the prearranged agreement, meaning I upheld my end of the legal contract while still removing him from the deed. He walked away with a few $1,000s and a career that was now not just stalled, but officially toxic. His reputation in the industry was ruined. The raise he earned was gone, his accounts frozen during the corporate investigation, and the money he had spent was unrecoverable. I got the house, standing alone in the quiet, empty house after he left, smelling the faint but distinct odor of his expensive, traitorous cologne finally fading away. I felt an immense sense of peace. It wasn't the triumphant euphoria of revenge. It was the quiet relief of survival. I had kept the foundation of my life intact. The irony of the whole situation never escaped me. Mark's sudden success, the raise that was supposed to catapult us into a new lifestyle, was the catalyst for his ruin. If he had just stayed the project manager with a steady, average salary, he probably wouldn't have been attractive enough for Sarah Vance to risk a serious ethical breach, and he wouldn't have been desperate enough to commit outright fraud. His raise was the neon sign attracting the kind of trouble that eventually destroyed his life. He reached too high, based on a lie, and the entire structure collapsed. I, the mechanic who deals in tangible reality, was the one left standing on solid ground. I sit here now, months later, in the same house, but it feels fundamentally different. It's no longer our house, it is definitively mine. I finally got that kitchen renovation done, and every tile I laid and every fixture I installed felt like a victory for honest labor and foresight. The factory garage still smells like grease and gasoline, and I love it. My work is honest. My income is steady. I sleep soundly every night, a luxury Mark has certainly lost. The quiet resolution I found was rooted in the simple truth. You cannot build a meaningful life on a foundation of professional and personal lies. Mark got a raise, a temporary thrill, and a feeling of power, but the moment he used his success as an excuse to betray the values we shared, he signed his own financial and professional death sentence. The thought that lingers is this: the raise didn't just buy him a temporary affair, it bought my absolute freedom. If he hadn't gotten that huge, sudden bump, I might have struggled to believe his stress excuses. The raise was proof that he was operating at a level that required moral compromise. It was the financial smoking gun. Without that enormous monetary shift, the affair might have just been a messy, painful divorce. But because of the raise, the stress premium he and Sarah laughed about, I was able to tie the affair directly to corporate fraud, turning a personal betrayal into a professional catastrophe. I often think about the day I first heard the phrase, working closely. It used to sound like dedication. Now, it sounds like a hollow echo of a terrible lie. I don't regret sending those anonymous emails for a second. By exposing the fraud, I didn't just seek revenge on Mark. I protected myself from being dragged down by his eventual, inevitable collapse. The client would have discovered the fabricated data eventually, and the factory would have been ruined. By stepping in, I ensured that the blame landed precisely where it belonged. My life now is simpler, cleaner, and built on my own terms. My honest, steady income secured the house, the lawyer, and my peace of mind. Mark's quick, flashy money led to nothing but ruin. It's a powerful lesson, especially for anyone starting out. Don't chase the quick, flashy reward if it requires compromising your integrity. The steady, reliable foundation is the only thing that will hold when everything else collapses. I learned that trust is priceless, but a well-written contract and a separate bank account can be damn good substitutes when trust is broken. I'm not bitter, just wiser. I'm looking forward, not back. The house is quiet, the garage is full of work, and my future is entirely in my own reliable, grease-stained hands. So if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to make a tough call to protect yourself, or if you just enjoyed watching corporate karma deliver a massive dose of reality, drop a comment below, hit that like button, and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about how honesty and a good lawyer beat betrayal every single time.